Azerbaijan is becoming a strategic chess piece for European security and a real headache for Putin. Azerbaijan is located in the Caucasus, a region that, although it seems far away, is a powerful weapon that Putin uses to blackmail his European armies. It's a hotspot between Europe and Asia, rife with conflicts such as those in Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia, and Georgia, all of which are within Russia's sphere of influence. If Putin decided to destabilize the region, Europe could face new migration crises, instability along its borders, and increased military pressure. It would be similar to what happened after 2012 following the war in Syria, but that's not all. The southern gas corridor also passes through the Caucasus, allowing Europe to receive gas from the Caspian Sea directly without passing through Russia. So what does Azerbaijan have to do with all this? Well, in 2022, it signed a memorandum with the EU to double gas exports by 2027. Let's just say it moved closer to Europe as a reliable partner against Russia. The problem? Well, the Kremlin still has a lot of control and influence in the region, and it continues to threaten countries such as Georgia and Armenia, which don't dare to follow in Azerbaijan's footsteps. Now, if Azerbaijan proves that it can survive and prosper without Putin, if it manages to definitively betray the Russian bear and show itself as an ally of Europe, other countries could follow its example and massively dilute Putin's control over the region and the danger that this poses to Europe. This is where our story begins today. It's a story of spies, betrayals, and challenges. But first, let me ask you this. Remember the first iPhone launch in 2007? Back then, it felt like the future. Now, 1.38 billion people use one daily. What was once groundbreaking is just normal. The same thing's happening with AI, only much faster. What took Apple 15 years is happening in 15 months. The fascination stage is over. AI is everywhere, from tech to finance, education, and marketing. If you want to stay relevant, now's the time to build in-demand AI skills. That's why I'm excited about the 2-day AI Mastermind by Outskill, happening this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. In just 16 hours, you'll go from AI rookie to confident AI pro, guided by expert mentors and equipped with 10 plus powerful AI tools to future-proof your career. This training normally costs $895, but I've partnered with Outskill, the world's largest AI education platform, to give away 1,000 free seats exclusively for my audience. That's nearly $900,000 in training, free for the next 72 hours. Over 4 million people have already joined. You'll learn prompt engineering to get the best AI outputs, 10 plus essential AI tools like Make.com, Agentic Hub, and Claude, AI-powered Excel, presentations, agents, and automation, building interactive apps and websites. Whatever your background, HR, marketing, sales, operations, freelancing, this training is for you. Grab your seat via the link in the description and get bonuses. Join day 1 and get Prompt Bible, 3,000 plus prompts. Day 2, you'll receive Money-Making AI Roadmap, and both days, personalized AI Toolkit will be yours. Clear your calendar, your AI journey starts this weekend. Undercover and posing as Sputnik journalists. That's how Igor Kartovic and Yevgeny Belousov were hiding. 2 FSB agents, part of Russia's Federal Security Service, accused of espionage. And no, this isn't a movie. It's something that happened just recently in a small Caucasus country that's standing up to Russia. Take a look.
Azerbaijan detains alleged Russian spies as relations with Moscow nosedive.
Surprising? Well, it's not really a shock that Moscow would use any network, including its state-run media outlets, or rather, propaganda machines, to spy on others. What is surprising is that a country like Azerbaijan had the guts to stand up and expose that network, publicly accusing Russia of espionage. As you can imagine, this has brought relations with Russia to a historic low, and that's not even the whole story. Just days before the arrests, tensions were already boiling over. On June 27th, in the Russian industrial city of Yekaterinburg, Russian special forces carried out a violent raid targeting ethnic Azerbaijanis. Around 50 people were arrested, several were injured, and 2 Azerbaijani brothers, Ziadin and Hussein Safarov, died in custody under suspicious circumstances. Autopsies revealed severe trauma and broken ribs, directly contradicting the Russian claims that the men had died of a heart failure. In fact, survivors reported beatings, electrocution, and degrading treatment. All of this has been widely interpreted in Baku as a politically motivated act of intimidation, triggering an immediate response from the government and a wave of outrage among the Azerbaijani public.
The real reason behind Moscow's pressure on Baku revealed. The Azerbaijani state agency Azertak has drawn a stark comparison between Russia's current policies and those of Nazi Germany, arguing that the Kremlin is using war as a tool for internal repression and external coercion.
The authorities didn't take long to react, and react they did. Visa cancellations, suspension of official visits, Russians detained over ties to the Sputnik agents, and on top of that, a total ban on Russian cultural events on Azerbaijani soil. Yes, what once looked like a simple diplomatic pause has now turned into a full-blown crisis, one that keeps escalating. But honestly, we shouldn't be too surprised. Just look back in time a bit. You might remember that in December 2024, a civilian Azerbaijani plane was shot down from Russian territory and eventually crashed in Kazakhstan. The official explanation blamed a mistake by Russian air defense systems. In typical fashion, the Kremlin brushed it off with a simple, "We're sorry, but it wasn't our fault." At the time, Aliyev called it unacceptable and cast doubt on whether it was really an accident, as claimed, or something else entirely. And to top it all off, Baku followed up with a series of bold moves: the expulsion of pro-Russian party members, the closure of Russian cultural centers, and a calculated push to fast-track its gas supply plans to Europe, even involving Ukraine, and completely ignoring Moscow. Do you think these are just coincidences? Well, it doesn't look like it. It's starting to feel more like the opening moves in a chess game between two countries with a deep, shared history. Azerbaijan is a former Soviet republic, and its ties with Moscow have always been significant. In fact, this is why Azerbaijan has traditionally maintained a balanced foreign policy, not too aligned with the West, but not too close to Moscow either. At least that's how it used to be, because right now we're starting to see headlines as striking as this one.
The beginning of a wonderful friendship. Kyiv offered Baku the use of its underground gas storage facility.
And if all this wasn't enough to show how deep the rift between Baku and Moscow really is, wait, because you haven't seen the biggest move yet. As you know, Azerbaijan and Armenia have long had a hostile relationship due to territorial and ethnic disputes. And for Armenia, Russia has long acted as a sort of insurance policy. In fact, there's a Russian military base in Armenia, supposedly to keep tensions in the Nagorno-Karabakh region from spiraling out of control. Well, now Azerbaijan is also making moves to bring all of that to an end. Check this out.
Armenia and Azerbaijan move closer to peace, pushing Russia out from the South Caucasus.
Yes, something that seemed impossible until very recently has just happened. The leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan met a few days ago in Abu Dhabi to finalize a peace agreement after nearly 4 decades of conflict. Peace that, not long ago, seemed totally out of reach. Yet here it is, becoming reality right as Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine. Just a coincidence? But wait, there's more. After the downing of the plane, Azerbaijan also began reviewing its energy strategy. Have you heard of the Southern Gas Corridor? Now, it has the green light to supply gas to Europe and help cut the continent's dependence on Russian energy. All of this while NATO, Turkey, and the European Union quietly applaud Baku's new direction. And yes, I know what many of you are probably wondering. What on earth happened to make Azerbaijan and Russia end up like this? What changed? Are we witnessing a total turning point for Russia's power in the Caucasus? Well, we're going to answer all those questions and more in this video. What we're about to show you might just be the beginning of the end for Russia's grip on one of its traditional backyard regions, the Caucasus. Stay tuned.
The silent defeat.
To understand this story, we first need to travel back to 1991. That was the year the Soviet Union officially collapsed, and 15 new independent states were born. Among them, Azerbaijan. And of course, in those early years, this small country couldn't breathe without Moscow. Economically, politically, militarily, Russia was still its big boss. And not just because of their shared history. Baku depended on Moscow to deal with internal conflicts, like the bloody war with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh. You know that friend who protects you in school fights but then eats half your lunch? That's pretty much what Russia was in the 90s. It helped keep some kind of order, but only in exchange for keeping a firm grip on the region. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan Azerbaijan was just trying to survive and make it out of the post-Soviet chaos. But in the 2000s, with Ilham Aliyev in power, things began to shift. The country started to take full advantage of its golden goose in the Caspian Sea, oil and gas. Foreign investment poured into its energy sector. Exports surged thanks to the BTC pipeline opened in 2006. And to top it off, international oil prices were sky high. All of that meant Azerbaijan's dependence on Moscow was becoming less and less important. In fact, the Kremlin's game was so cynical that it sold weapons to both sides, Baku and Yerevan, while profiting from energy trade and keeping troops in the region. In short, they controlled the backyard however they wanted. But like in any toxic relationship, things are bound to blow up sooner or later.
Putin's war in Ukraine may cost him control of the South Caucasus.
But how did we go from friends forever to shove your tanks where the sun doesn't shine? Well, because there are things that you don't see at first glance. And that's exactly what Azerbaijan did. Start looking beyond the usual suspects. In other words, it began really looking towards Turkey and the West. Yes, Russia was still around, still an important partner, but little by little, Ankara started taking over the role of Big Brother. In fact, in 2020, Baku, with Turkish support and Israeli and Turkish technology, won the 44-day war against Armenia, Moscow's favorite child, taking control of large areas of Nagorno-Karabakh. And what did Russia do? Well, not much. It sent around 2,000 troops as peacekeepers to patrol the Lachin corridor and the contact line, and brokered a ceasefire. That's it. And you can just imagine the look on the Armenians' faces as they lost territory while Russian protection proved completely useless. And it doesn't even end there. What really keeps Moscow up at night is the thought of its old allies starting to court NATO and the West.
The EU market is unique in terms of legislation, regulations, and prices, but we shouldn't just look to the West, we can look to the East and the South. This is important for the future of Azerbaijan's gas industry and Europe's energy security.
The problem is that Russia still sees the Caucasus as its own backyard, and we all know what happens when someone steps into your backyard uninvited. So when Azerbaijan started negotiating energy exports with Europe, strengthening its army with Turkish weapons, and standing up to Russian pressure, Putin decided to send them a reminder in the form of spies. The result? Exactly what you're seeing. A cat and mouse game, with Baku arresting alleged Russian agents while Moscow denies everything and brushes it off as a misunderstanding. But the truth is, whether Russia likes it or not, Azerbaijan is no longer the weak, poor country of the 1990s that was easy to control. These days, it's a key energy player with regional ambitions and a foreign policy that's becoming increasingly independent. Baku doesn't even need Russia anymore to sell its gas. In fact, since 2020, Azerbaijan has been exporting energy directly to Europe without having to go through Russia, thanks to the launch of new pipelines along the Southern Gas Corridor. This is a gas pipeline network backed by the European Union for over a decade. The goal? To connect the entire continent, from Italy to the Caspian Sea fields, via Georgia, Turkey, Greece, and Albania. And of course, that clearly makes Azerbaijan a new strategic partner for Brussels, and gives it much more political freedom. Let's not forget its most loyal ally, Turkey. Ankara has supplied Bayraktar TB2 drones, military training, and diplomatic support, right when Baku needed it the most. It's a partnership that sounds more like a brotherhood than just strategic convenience. In fact, both countries officially use the phrase "two states, one nation" to refer to their ethnic and cultural kinship. But pay attention, because the masterstroke is yet to come, and it's called the Zangezur Corridor. This is a planned highway and railway corridor outlined in the November 2020 ceasefire agreement, intended to connect Azerbaijan's mainland with its Nakhchivan exclave, running through southern Armenia. From there, it would link directly to Turkey via an existing connection. The catch, of course, is that Armenia would have to open up a passage through its territory, essentially granting a land corridor with no Armenian border control. That's likely to be the trickiest part of the plan. But taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, here's what we've got. While Europe has been racing toward an energy future free from Moscow, Azerbaijan has been quietly repositioning itself as a key alternative. And that's no accident. In fact, back in July 2022, Brussels signed a memorandum with Baku to double the natural gas supply to Europe to about 20 billion cubic meters by 2027, reducing the continent's reliance on Russian gas. And thanks to the Southern Gas Corridor, Azeri gas already reaches countries like Greece, Albania, and Italy before being distributed further north into the European Union.
Azerbaijan vows to raise gas exports to Europe to 20 billion cubic meters per year by 2027. Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev has promised the country will raise natural gas exports to the European Union this year to 13 billion cubic meters and 20 billion cubic meters per year potentially by 2027.
But here's the thing. Russia isn't about to let Azerbaijan slip away without a fight. That's where the covert operations, disinformation campaigns, and, of course, spies come in. So let's lay out a couple of hypotheses. First, tensions between Baku and Moscow are just getting started. Russia will keep trying to undermine Azerbaijan's independence using its usual playbook: espionage, economic pressure, and political interference. Let's not forget that for Putin, the Caucasus is almost as strategic as Ukraine. Losing influence there would be yet another blow to his domestic narrative. Second, Azerbaijan will continue drawing closer to Turkey, and more cautiously, to the West, with Europe desperate for gas, and Ankara pushing for a stronger Turkic bloc. Baku has more reason than ever to keep moving in that direction. So, the inevitable question is, can Azerbaijan keep its balance without ending up as another battlefield like Ukraine? Well, don't expect any sudden moves. Baku is going to play it safe. They know that completely breaking ties with Russia would be like pulling a bear's beard, and that bear still has plenty of ways to stir up trouble in the region. So, in short, Baku wants to be independent, wealthy, and powerful, but it still lives in a neighborhood where Moscow calls a lot of the shots. And speaking of the neighborhood, what about the other countries? Does Putin's sphere of influence stop at Azerbaijan? Where and how is the Kremlin moving its chess pieces across the region? What's happening in Azerbaijan is just the tip of the iceberg, one small part of a much broader power structure that Moscow has spent decades building, and now that structure may finally be starting to crumble.
The Caucasus Web.
What Russia has built in the Caucasus isn't just about diplomatic influence. It's not even some soft power strategy. It's a full-blown web of control. A web woven over decades to entangle governments, business leaders, military officers, journalists, and yes, even bakers if needed. And no, I am not exaggerating. The Caucasus has been, from the Tsarist era through the Soviet Union and into modern times, one of the regions where Moscow has intervened most heavily. And it's done so with a uniquely Russian mix of imperial-style paternalism, espionage, sabotage, military deals, and an uncanny talent for slipping its hand into its neighbors' pockets without anyone daring to push back. Or at least, that's how it used to be. Because, surprise, surprise, that whole system is starting to fall apart. But the real question is, what's actually left standing of Russian power in the Caucasus? What's really at stake here? Well, here's the thing. Every single thread of that web matters. And if even one thread breaks, the whole structure could come crashing down.
Russian-Armenian relations deteriorated last year when Armenia threatened to withdraw from the Collective Security Treaty Organization. It adds that Russia has deployed information operations to denigrate Armenian democracy and its more pro-Western leaders.
To begin with, let's not forget one crucial thing. The Soviet legacy still weighs heavily. Take Armenia, for example. The Russian FSB doesn't just have influence there, it's literally embedded within Armenia's National Security Service. And that's not a metaphor. They share infrastructure and databases. In fact, Russian intelligence even controls part of Armenia's borders. But that's not even the most striking part. In Gyumri, Armenia's second largest city, Russia maintains a massive military base, packed with thousands of troops, radar systems, and air defenses pointed straight at the Turkish skies. We're talking about the largest Russian military installation in the entire South Caucasus, with up to 5,000 personnel, just 3.5 kilometers from the Turkish border. Yes, Yerevan has complained about Moscow's inaction in Nagorno-Karabakh, but with that kind of presence on the ground, and the fear of being completely exposed to Azerbaijan and Turkey, Armenia can't even begin to imagine cutting ties with Moscow entirely. That said, not everyone has opted to just grin and bear it. Georgia is clearly the black sheep of the neighborhood. Since the Rose Revolution in 2003, Tbilisi has tried everything to break away from Russia's orbit. And what happened? Well, we all remember. A lightning war in 2008, South Ossetia and Abkhazia occupied, non-stop propaganda, and a spy network that's just as active today as it was back then. Moscow controls local leaders in both separatist regions and uses its agents agents to destabilize the Georgian government whenever it starts leaning too much toward NATO or the European Union. And here's the kicker. The current ruling party in Georgia is starting to dangerously tilt toward an anti-Western stance. Why? Well, it might have something to do with this. 20% of Georgia's territory is occupied by Russian-backed proxies, and with 1/5 of the country in the hands of the Russian-backed separatists, cutting all Kremlin ties simply isn't possible. In the separatist enclaves, Russian influence is absolute. Absolutely nothing happens there without Moscow knowing about it. Russian intelligence services directly run the local police, and funding comes straight from Russia's Ministry of Finance. In short, yes, we can say the Kremlin still controls the region, even when others no longer want to be controlled. Now, you might be wondering, what about the other neighbors? Well, this is where the smaller ones come into play. Chechnya, Ingushetia, and Dagestan. Although they're formally part of the Russian Federation, they are key to understanding how and why Moscow operates here. These republics are the ones that worry the Kremlin the most, due to their history of insurgency and Islamist terrorism. And that's exactly why Moscow pours massive amounts of money into subsidies and loyalty buying schemes to keep them in check. To give you an idea, take a look at this.
Kadyrov reveals Russia's spending in Chechnya. Kadyrov, Russia spends 300 billion rubles a year on maintaining Chechnya.
So yes, Russia's networks in the Caucasus are everywhere, from embassies and official agreements to the dark corners of espionage, bribery, psychological operations, and direct military occupation. And while the arrest of agents in Baku may have stirred the hornet's nest, that doesn't mean the nest is empty. But which countries might be next to follow Azerbaijan's lead and dare to challenge Moscow? Well, with some caveats, we could say Georgia is the most likely candidate. It has a long tradition of resisting Russian influence and a more pro-Western electorate. That said, let's not kid ourselves. Georgia's economy is still heavily reliant on remittances sent by Georgians working in Russia, which account for around 15% of the country's GDP. And while less so than before, it still depends on energy controlled by Moscow, so breaking ties would come at a huge cost. As for other territories like Abkhazia or South Ossetia, resistance isn't even on the table. And Armenia, while afraid of being dominated by Azerbaijan and Turkey, is starting to show signs of fatigue and is looking to diversify its alliances.
We can't rely on Russia to protect us anymore, Armenian PM says. Once one of the Kremlin's closest allies, Armenia is now conducting joint drills with US soldiers.
At this point, you're probably asking the big question: why does Russia care so much about not losing Azerbaijan? Well, to start with, Baku is Moscow's gateway to the Caspian Sea, its oil, its gas, and to the trade routes connecting to Iran and Central Asia. But what the Kremlin fears the most isn't just losing influence in one country, it's the domino effect. Because if Azerbaijan breaks away and proves it can thrive without Moscow, the message will be clear to everyone. Armenia might dare to pivot further west. Georgia could toughen its stance. Belarus's regime could start to wobble. And even places like Dagestan or Chechnya might begin questioning whether sticking with Putin is really worth it, subsidies or not. And let me tell you, that is the Kremlin's nightmare. Especially now when Moscow has already suffered too many strategic losses, the latest being Syria, with the fall of Assad. So, a full-blown uprising in the Caucasus is the last thing Moscow wants to deal with right now. That's why the Kremlin's reactions are growing more aggressive, reinforcing its bases in Armenia, threatening Georgia with sanctions, and launching disinformation campaigns to plant doubt in the region's governments. Because what's really at stake here is Moscow's ability to keep being seen as the regional power broker. But now, what do you think? Will other countries follow in Azerbaijan's footsteps? Will they dare to challenge the bear? Or will they settle for staying tangled in the web? Do you think peace with Armenia will finally blow up what's left of Russia's influence there? Leave us your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. And before you go, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't done so already. As always, thanks for being there. Take care. I'll see you next time.